Hello, and welcome to Running the Table, the podcast where we run through everything on the table in the world of sports. And we're back for another week of fantasy football stardom situms, where we give you just a little bit of advice, some guys to start, some guys to sit for this week's matchup in fantasy football. So, Tim, are you ready to go?
Let's run it.
Let's do it. So, if you didn't watch last week's episode, we did that, and now we're going to review how we did. We told you to start Russell Wilson, Miles Sanders, and Mike Evans, and they all did pretty well. Wilson with 17.8 points, Sanders with 18.5 points, and found the end zone for the first time in like 2 years.
A
And
while.
and Mike Evans with 18.1 points, with Chris Godwin going down relatively early. We told you to sit Derek Carr, Breece Hall, and Deontay Johnson. Derek Carr had 13.8 points with 3 interceptions. Breece Hall was in a ugly timeshare. He got 10.1 points, was a pretty active part of the receiving game, but only saw 6 carries
But
on the ground.
Carter massively outperformed him
Mm-hmm.
points wise. I believe Carter had 18 or around there somewhere.
Yeah. He was on Breece Hall was on the back end of that
Yeah.
committee, and Deontay Johnson got 12.5 points. Saw a lot of volume, but didn't really do much with that. So I think it's fair to say we did okay.
Yeah, I mean, we only you could call slightly missed the mark on saying that. I mean, Deontay Johnson did end up being healthy enough to play and receive that type of volume, which is what made him a big enough part of that offense. But a lot of those things are pretty hard to predict ahead of time, knowing when a guy is going to be like a game time decision, depending on how he feels. But I
Yeah.
think we did pretty good.
Yeah, I think so too. So now
See if we can recreate that.
let's get into this week's starts and sets with our quarterback to start being Kirk Cousins against the
Whew,
Philadelphia Eagles. Kirk looked really, really good
that offense
last
looked
week
really
against the
good.
Packers. And I mean, having Justin Jefferson, who's arguably going to be the wide receiver one in fantasy football, that really helps his case. And they're just going to look to air it out. And the Philadelphia Eagles last week let Detroit hang 35 on them. So that's kind of a
They've
concern.
shown that they have the ability to get torched,
Yeah.
especially by wide receivers and whatnot. But overall, I think that offense is just going to be clicking on all cylinders.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the Lions can put up 35, I don't see there's any reason why the Vikings can't put up at least similar numbers.
Yeah, exactly. Kirk's going to look to air it out to Jefferson, Thielen, maybe Dalvin a little bit. Maybe Bigger Smith will be involved a little bit. Who knows? But Tim, who is our quarterback to sit?
So our quarterback to sit going into this week would be Joe Burrow, and
Oh,
that's
Joe Shiesty.
not exactly. It's a little bit of a surprise given the name, but if you saw his performance last week, you can understand why. He had 4 interceptions, 5 total turnovers last week, and some of those interceptions
Yeah.
were really just they were just bad judgment calls. He tried to fit balls into too tight of spaces there, and they ended up getting burned for it. And the other thing is, if I'm not mistaken, I believe T. Higgins is going to be out going into this week. So that leaves another weapon that potentially is going to be off the table for him. And Dallas does have a pretty solid defense that, despite the Buccaneers handling them pretty well, they held the Buccaneers to, I believe it was 4 field goals. Like
Yeah.
that's an
Really
offense that
stepped
we
up big in the
expected.
red
Yeah,
zone.
we expected Buccaneers offense to kind of just go to town because that's what we've seen out of the Bucks against Dallas in the past. But Dallas's defense looks good enough to potentially give the Bengals some trouble this week.
Yeah, and I mean those 5 turnovers, you can't really ignore that. Even though the Steelers defense played really well, you can't quite, it's probably the
Burrow's one of
worst
those guys this week that I
one
mean,
of the
I think
worst games that Joe
he's gonna
Burrow ever
be
had
fine.
last week.
Burrow's gonna be fine, but I just think that it's one of those that's on a fringe. If you have a guy
Hmm.
that has higher upside, this is probably the week to let him overtake Burrow just to see whether or not they can get, their feet underneath him going forward.
Yeah, and just another note, if T. Higgins doesn't play, a slight boost to Tyler Boyd if you have
Yeah.
him in PPR league, so that's going to be pretty big also. So our running back to start this week is a running back that is back from the grave, it seems like, Saquon Barkley. And he's just really good. He's just really
He
good.
he looked he looked as close to the old Saquon that we pretty much have seen in the last
Yeah.
2 years. And of course, the hope is that he can stay this healthy. But while he's healthy, he's one of those guys that you have to play him if you have him.
You
If
have
you're
to
able to
start
pick him
him.
up later, most of the times he was picked
Yeah,
up relatively early. But he's a must
like
play right now. while
If
the
you
Giants
got
are
him at
still
like a
playing well.
second or a third round grade, you're like late second, mid third round grade, or even like later, you're jumping for joy because
He's looking super valuable right now.
this guy is an auto start the rest of the way. I mean, what he did against the Titans last week, 18 carries, 164 yards, and a touchdown. That's good for 33.4 fantasy points, which was week one's RB1. Saquon Barkley is back. So if you have him, do not sit him. Start him as much as you can. Take it
Especially,
and run.
especially you got to take advantage of it while he's healthy. Since you don't
Exactly.
know what might happen, take advantage of that as much as you got.
Yeah. Tim, who's our running back to sit?
All right, so our running back to sit this week is a running back that I was a little bit higher on going into the season, but the week one matchup told us a little bit about his situation. That would be Rashaad Penny. He was one of those guys that ended last season on an absolute tear, but going into this season, especially with the way that that offense ran in that Broncos game, it just doesn't seem to be it's a lot of a game script issue. There's not going to be many
Mm-hmm.
games where the Seahawks are going to be up big and running the ball a lot. So he's not going to get a lot of those big heavy rushing games like he was towards the end of the season that made him have those big numbers. But he had a mediocre week last year, not great point wise, but rushing wise, he was 12 rushes for 60 yards, and he had 2 receptions for 7 yards. And the big thing is he's not huge in the receiving game, and that's going
Yeah,
to be
and
his
that's
big
what's going to
that's
hurt
going to be his
him.
big downfall
Yeah.
throughout a lot of this year. Is if he's not going to be able to get big volume in the rushing game, he's not going to be that good of a fantasy option. And with Geno Smith looking the way he did week one, I don't see that they're going to have much of any reason to try to just pound the rock and hope that that works because they've shown that their passing game is actually significantly better than most of us expected it to be.
And also, they're playing the 49ers, and the
Yeah.
49ers have a very, very good front seven that can make running
Oh
games
yeah.
nightmarish. So
Mm-hmm.
that's another thing to consider. So Rashaad Penny is our running back to sit. Our wide receiver to start this week, Michael Pittman Jr. What a breakout that this guy has had. He's picked up right where he
He
left
stepped
off
up. Yeah.
last week against the Texans. 9 catches, 13 targets, 121 yards, and a touchdown. That was good for 27.1 fantasy points. He has established himself as the clear wide receiver one in Indianapolis.
By
It's
far.
really not
It's
even
not even
close.
close.
It's not even close. And Matt Ryan historically has force fed his number one target. You look at what he did all those years with Julio Jones. Now,
Well, and you saw a good example of that week one, even when they weren't
that's not
necessarily.
exactly comparing Michael Pittman Jr. to prime Julio Jones
No,
because
certainly not.
I think that's a tad bit of a
But
stretch to
it's
say
it's
right
that
now.
role comparison
But
and the way
yes.
that he's going to treat. I mean, you saw 13 targets in week one, and that was a game where their offense wasn't really doing all that well until like the fourth quarter,
Mm-hmm.
really. And that's where he ended up with that touchdown, and I think he's going to be a big target for them, going especially in the red zone and just a lot of those goal to go situations. He's a big target. He's got great separation and whatnot. And he's one of those guys that, similar to the way that Matt Ryan dealt with Julio Jones, he's a guy you can chuck it up deep, and you know that Matt Ryan loves going for those every once in a while. And I think Pittman's going to be able to bring down those targets a good amount, so that's going to make him a very valuable receiver.
Yeah, it's simple. Michael Pittman Jr. is good in fantasy
Good.
because of high target share, good volume, and he makes the most of his opportunities. So
Absolutely.
that screams start for your lineups. But Tim, we're gonna wrap it
Talk about
up.
a guy. Talk
Who we
about a guy
sitting?
that didn't use or didn't wasn't able to take advantage of a lot of his opportunities. Our wide receiver to sit this week, that'd be CeeDee Lamb. Now, welcome to the team that just wasn't able to capitalize on opportunities. And now the Dallas Cowboys are in even worse of a situation than they were last week.
Yeah, it's
He
not
he was
great.
he was set to have a really good season, being the clear number one wide receiver until we saw the issues that the Dallas Cowboys ran into week one. They have nobody on the outside, and when you try to force feed CeeDee Lamb across the middle, teams know to defend it, or at least the Buccaneers did. He had 2 receptions on 11 targets.
It's not like they weren't trying to get him the ball. That was not
No,
the
they
issue.
were trying to force feed the ball
The
because
target share was not the issue.
no one else really had the ability to get open very well. But the problem is CD couldn't when he was practically getting doubled and tripled all the time. So he only ended up with 29 yards on those 2 receptions and just a measly 4.9 points. And the problem is that situation is not getting better. With Dak out, you have
Nope.
Cooper Rush in, who's not a he's nowhere near the passer that
But
Dak is, and
Tim,
even when Dak
Dallas
didn't look that great.
Cowboys fans are comparing this to the Tom Brady situation in 2001.
No,
Yeah.
no. I don't know where anyone's getting that from, but we've
Twitter.
seen Cooper.
Twitter,
We've
Tim.
seen Cooper Rush before,
We're getting
and
it from
Cooper
Twitter.
Rush. This is. I love Cooper Rush. I hope he's able to take advantage
Cooper
of his
Rush is Tom
opportunity.
Brady 2.0.
But Cooper Rush is probably going to hand
No,
the ball off
yeah.
a bunch so that they can rush a lot. So that's I feel like that's what they're going to fall back on. They're going to fall back on a heavy run game and dump down game to Zeke and Tony Pollard to try to get their yards going. Because I just don't think their passing offense is going to be very good after a week where it was extremely poor to begin with. So CeeDee Lamb is a guy that's really just massively fallen off. We won't mention him every week, but he's not a guy that's going to have a favorable matchup
Hmm.
realistically until Dak is back, most likely.
Yeah, and in this period when his value is way down, don't sell him if you have him. He's still a
No,
wide receiver one. He still has tons of talent. The volume is
and
still
he
there.
also
So if
has the ability
anything,
to be very valuable in the second half of the season, pushing
hmm
postseason. So that's one of the things. And but I guess if you're
buy low
looking
if you
to,
can.
yes,
Buy
if you
low on
have the
CeeDee
ability
Lamb.
to see if somebody is going to get frustrated with these next couple of weeks with CeeDee Lamb's difficult performances,
Fantasy
and
football is a long season and you have to stay patient. So if
yeah,
you can make an under the radar move like trading for CeeDee Lamb, at
absolutely.
not exactly what his value was 2 weeks ago, I say pull the trigger. But Tim, we
For
got
sure.
anything else?
No, I mean we've got an interesting week of games here heading into this weekend, and I think we're gonna be excited to see what these matchups can bring for some of these guys. So stay tuned. We've got a lot more coming up in terms of different content for NFL and college football.
Heck
So
yeah,
if
Tim, do that outro.
hey, if you like what we do, hit that like and subscribe. And there's plenty more videos to watch, tons of playlists, football, basketball. Go back, you'll find a ton. So until next time, we out.